Okay.
All right. Sounds very official.
I know. Well, hello and welcome everybody. The West Tisbury Library is very pleased to be hosting today's event with Ken Langer. Today, Ken will be discussing his new novel, A Nest for Lalita. Ken's love of India began when he spent a college year in Varanasi. After earning his PhD in Sanskrit and Indian studies from Harvard, he spent 2 years in Pune, India, translating Sanskrit love poetry, and another 2 years in New Delhi as a consultant to US high-tech and renewable energy companies. He also served in a number of senior advisory roles in the federal government in both Harvard and Brandeis universities. He is the founder of EMSI, an international green building consultant company, which pioneered the green building industry in China. His short stories, essays, and book reviews have appeared in numerous journals and newspapers, including our local Vineyard Gazette. And just some fun facts about Ken's connection to the island here. The island has been an important part of Ken's life since the late 60s, when his mother, Nikki Langer, bought the old Fenner barn on South Road. Nikki and her husband, Jacob Weissman, retired there in the early 80s, and Ken spent at least part of his summers in Chilmark since college. In 1994, he got married to Jennifer Smith on her family's property in West Tisbury. Ken and Jen and their 2 children have been spending at least part of their summers in West Tisbury ever since. And Ken's sister, Elizabeth Langer, I think she's on the call right now. Hi, Elizabeth. And her husband, law professor Richard Chusett, have both worked with our library in past summers through art exhibits and lectures. So we're glad to have another member of the family speaking for us today. Just something about our Zoom meeting I want to mention before we get started. You could keep yourself muted during the talk. That would be wonderful, just so we don't hear dogs barking in your home or whatever's going on in the background. And then during the Q&A, we welcome you to unmute yourself and ask your questions and make comments. We would love to hear your voice. So thank you so much for coming, and welcome, Ken.
Well, thanks, Olivia. This is a very small and informal group, mostly friends and family, so we're going to take it real easy today. Thank you, and thanks the library. The library has also been a very important part of my life here. I just love going to the West Tisbury Library every summer. I'm here, and have spent time even writing some of my chapters at the tables in those libraries. So it's all like coming home. So before we start, I want to read from the book itself, obviously. But before we start, I asked Olivia to run a very short, it's a 1-minute book trailer, which summarizes the plot with some really cool visuals. And I think it can get your blood heated up a little for the rest of the hour, okay? You want to do that, Olivia?
Yep. Working on it right now.
Okay.
Okay, can you all see this? Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
Hold on.
MEENA Kaul is the director of Behera House, a safe haven for survivors.
Oops, I'm sorry.
We lost the volume.
No, it just paused.
Of domestic violence. When the stock market crashes, MEENA is forced to accept funding from the ultra-right-wing Hindu Party. But her worst fears come to pass when the Hindu Party wins the national election and starts chipping away at women's rights, drawing Behera House into its political web. When Simon Bliss, America's top green architect, comes to India to design the new community centre, he falls for MEENA and is quickly sucked into her perilous world of Indian politics. To win her affection, he takes on corrupt politicians, shady priests, and crooked businessmen. Can MEENA and Simon survive the Hindu Party's ruthless political games and save Behera House?
Okay. So, so as you can see, a little corny at times, but as you can see, the main plot, for those of you who haven't read the book or don't know, is about this woman, MEENA KAUL. She's a social activist, a feminist, and she runs a home for survivors of women survivors of domestic violence. And everything is going quite well until the roof sort of falls in on her, the floor falls in on her, and she loses her funding for an expansion. And when the funding falls through, the largest industrial, or the third largest industrial house in India, the Behera Group, who is behind this non-governmental organization that she's running, steps in with a grant. The problem is that it's not really Behera House stepping in with the grant, but it's the Hindu party, the fundamentalist Hindu party stepping in with a grant, a construction grant. And as the novel progresses, MEENA gets, the chokehold of this party, of this fundamentalist party, becomes tighter and tighter and tighter around her neck. And what we see, and what I think is most interesting about the novel, is MEENA and those people around her trying to extricate herself from this tradition, from the old patriarchy of India. And so what you really have here in this novel is a kind of tug of war between the feminist or progressive side, the modern India, and the real people, and especially the women who have, who are in the forefront of women's rights, sort of bucking against tradition and the patriarchy. As you heard from Olivia, I've spent a lot of time in India, and I wrote this novel. I think Abby put it, or I was quoted in this review that Abby had written, saying that writing the novel was like taking little marigold petals that were strewn across the road. And those were my experiences in India over decades, and sort of stringing them together into a story. I mean, of course, it's not autobiographical, but at the same time, it all comes from my experiences. And it was rather therapeutic putting it all together like this. The one thing I want to just say, one more thing I want to say before we start the reading, is why I wrote about a woman, and why I wrote about a woman protagonist who is a feminist and a social activist. Because I know with all the talk of cultural appropriation and what have you, it's rather strange, and many would say, does a American male have the right to be writing in the voice of a woman, an Indian woman, no doubt, from this background? Well, I just want to say in my defense, and you can accept it or not, but in my defense, that I did my PhD dissertation on Sanskrit poetry. And in Sanskrit poetry, the women are inevitably beautiful, they're docile, subservient, and they're very forgiving when their husbands go off and have their transgressions and what have you. And I love the poetry, it's beautiful stuff. But I realized later on in my life that my eyes were kind of closed to the reality of these women. And I lived in India about 10 years later with my first wife, who happened to have been Indian, and she was a social activist herself. And our circle of friends were social activists, and they were working on poverty and domestic violence and all sorts of issues of injustice. And it really pried my eyes open to women, especially the poorer women in rural India. And I began to feel a little guilty, to be honest, that I was so blind earlier to the reality around me. So writing the novel became a kind of atonement. It was a way to prove to myself that I was, if not woke, at least that I was standing on the right side of history. So with that said, I wrote a novel about a very strong woman and her fight against this patriarchal system. So let me start with a passage from the prologue. I'm just going to start with the very beginning of the book, which is the prologue. I'm only going to read for 15 or 20 minutes, then give you an opportunity to ask questions. So the prologue is undoubtedly the most difficult 3 pages of the whole book, because it explains who Lalita is. This is a nest for Lalita. And it explains the tragedy that happens to Lalita, which triggers the whole setting up of this home, if you will, for survivors. Okay, so it takes place in 1970 in a small village of Babai near Mumbai, or what was then Bombay. The commute from Bombay's financial center to Babai was living hell. Lalita's feet ached as stinking workers crushed in on her from all sides, some on purpose, with eyes like hot coals raking over her body. As the rickety bus approached her village and slowed, she mustered all her courage and jumped off. Her mood lightened on the walk home. Finally, no jerks brushing against her breasts or pinching her buttocks. She thought about Mr. Behera, so kind and gentle. Who would have imagined the big boss's son, heir to the Behera group, would take an interest in a barefoot Dalit, an invisible sweeper girl? He noticed her burn marks and offered to take her to a real doctor. She pictured the gold necklace he gave her, saying she could sell it if she ever needed money to escape her cruel husband. But how could she? For somebody who grew up in Bombay's sprawling shanty town, it was like owning a piece of the sun. Lalita valued the necklace more than her life. Most of all, she treasured the man who treated her like a goddess. The young heir to the Behera group was always respectful, gentle, never trying to take advantage of her. Unlike every other man she'd known, including her useless father, a pair of ruddy shell ducks who soared above. She shook her head. If only humans were so loyal to one another. She passed the neighborhood shrine to Shiva, where a yogi sat cross-legged, meditating under a majestic banyan tree. A garland of rudraksha seeds hung over his protruding ribs. Long coils of matted hair looked like aerial roots, as if he had merged with the tree. What a blessed life, sitting day after day in a trance. No job, no chores, no money problems, and best of all, no useless husband. She had been married only 2 years, but that was 1.5 too many. The trouble started when Ram lost his position, guarding a sprawling bungalow on Malabar Hill. Soon he was drinking away her meager earnings and stubbing cigarettes out on her arms. She finally arrived at her hut at the edge of a wide field of bright yellow sunflowers. She made herself a cup of chai, a cup of dark brown tea, 100 mil chai, the kind that could sustain a trucker for 100 miles. She drank from the saucer and waited for the caffeine to kick in. After checking the rice and the dal for small stones, she threw a dung cake into the mud stove and sprinkled it with kerosene. She was about to light the fire when Ram burst through the door. Well, I'm not going to continue with this prologue, but needless to say, Ram comes in and is very drunk, and in a jealous fit of anger, he accuses her of having slept with this boss, the son's boss of where she works, and won't take no for an answer. Won't take her word for that she had no relationship with this boss, and he basically drags her into a field and douses her with kerosene and lights her on fire. It's undoubtedly a very hard passage to read, but it is important because it was that incident after which Mr. Behera, the young son here, well, young, he's about 25 at the time, he vows to set up a center 4 women who've suffered or survived domestic violence. Unfortunately, he can't do anything about Lalita, but he can at least try to help those who have survived the same fate. So it took him 35 years, but he finally did it. And then the first chapter takes place in 2005 in this town of Sonepur, which is a fictitious town on the east coast of India. And it is in Sonepur that Mr. Behera, who's now the head of the whole Behera group, this industrial house, it is in this town that he has his ancestral home. And it's his ancestral home which has become the center of this Behera House, which is about to be expanded. So let me read you a little bit about MEENA, now, who has been hired to run this about 5 years ago. She's been hired to run this institute, and she's driving home in the terrible traffic of this small city, nothing like New Delhi, where she had grown up. MEENA dreaded the evening commute. Sonepur's streets were a dusty, tangled mess, nothing like Delhi, with its wide boulevards and stately bungalows. The roads were far too narrow for the crush of cars, trucks, and scooter rickshaws, let alone bullock carts and bony cows. They were clogged like an old man's arteries. And why do people think there's only one lane when there are 3? But the commute was a small price to pay for her dream job. No one else in her master's program at Delhi University was already heading up a non-governmental organization. Stopping for a group of men who had stumbled into the street, she worried about her husband. Kesh had not been himself since they moved to Sonepur 5 years ago. He was far too far from his office in New Delhi and missed the hustle bustle of his architectural firm. As MEENA maneuvered through the city, she recalled a conversation with Madhav Behera soon after they had moved to Sonepur. The industrialist behind Behera House could not understand why she would refuse a car and driver. Even at 30, MEENA was not confident behind the wheel and surely would have benefited, but no self-respecting activist would dare be seen in a chauffeured Mercedes. Behera finally gave in, but not without some stern advice. MEENA, he said, Sonepur is not New Delhi. If you insist on driving, please remember to leave your manners at the door. To get anywhere, you must act as if you own the road. And don't forget the streets have their own caste system, oversized lorries, and sacred cows are the Brahmins. Don't mess with them. Then come the Mercedes and other luxury automobiles, the Kshatriya warriors. After that, you have the Marutis and all the other mid-size and low-price cars. They're like the Vaishya farmers. Finally, the Shudras, the bottom feeders, common scooters and rickshaws. Everything on 2 wheels or legs is untouchable. MEENA remembered shuddering at the word untouchable, which nobody used anymore. But as a new hire, she was too shy to speak up. You must first know your place in the pecking order, Behera continued. Yield to those above you, negotiate with your equals, and sit on your horn to blow everyone else out of the water. So you get a sense of how I try to bring my experience of India into the conversation here. A little further on, she is in the traffic and suddenly a deafening horn jolted her back to the present. She looked into the rearview mirror and saw a Tata truck barreling toward her. The road vibrated under its weight. She veered to the side until the 8-wheeler whipped by, belching clouds of smoke. As it sped into the distance, the motley crew of vehicles and creatures sprung back into action, and the scene returned to its normal state of mayhem. Then a thunderous crash, as if the monsoon had come 3 months early, but the sky was deep blue without a single cloud. Reconciled through, I'm skipping some paragraphs, reconciled to a long wait, MEENA opened her briefcase and dug out a report on Indian women and dowry law. But the sentences were long and obtuse. Her mind seemed frozen, unable to navigate beyond the images of her angry husband and the dead boy. This truck had killed a boy. It was as if her head were stuck in a traffic jam of its very own. So she finally gets home, and she is 2 hours late. And as I said, she got stuck in this traffic jam because of a terrible accident where a young boy who was carrying tea to a sari shop, which they actually frequented. MEENA actually went to this sari shop to buy new saris for the women who came to Behera House. So she comes into the door, and now I'll give you just a little bit of a sense of her husband, Keish. What took you so long? Keish barked. You're 2 hours late. MEENA walked into the dining room, cringing at his sharp tone. Her husband was already seated at the dinner table, puffing a gauloise and nursing a bourbon. With a deep frown, he leaned against the tall back of a wooden chair carved with frolicking elephants, their thick trunks wrapped around blossoming trees. Dressed in a white kurta, embroidered with flowers around her neck and sleeves, Keish was beginning to look like his father, his late father, a former Maharaja of a small princely state tucked into the Himalayan foothills. Sorry, Keish, there was a terrible accident on MG Road. I wanted to call, but I left my mobile at the office. She planted a kiss on his cheek and headed to the bathroom. A young boy was hit and killed by a lorry, which swerved to dodge a goat, Keish added. Pardon? A goat, he called after her. There are more goats than people in Sompur. The ratio is 12.5 to 1. I read an article by Professor Billy Gotra at Sompur Technical College. Get it? Billy Gotra? Anyway, what else do I have to do in Sompur, the armpit of the world? My office in Delhi is running quite fine, just quite fine without me. Sorry, dear, MEENA called out as she dried her hands and emerged from the bathroom. What did you say? Keish raised his voice. I said, what else do I have to do in this armpit of the world? Well, I suppose India's got a lot of armpits, since every bloody deity has 10 arms. No, something about goats. Anyway, the conversation goes on until, and it really escalates the argument. And the argument is because Keish has been passed over. He's the greenest architect in all of India, and yet Mr. Behera is intent on hiring a Western architect, what he calls a starchitect, to design the expanded campus. And Keish is just furious because Keish has actually become quite good friends with Mr. Behera. So he says at one point, why do we need a bloody Western architect? Am I not good enough for your victims of violence, your burned and battered brood? Sorry if it sounds like I'm talking about a batch of overcooked pancakes. He looked exceedingly pleased with himself. What was that supposed to be funny? These women are suffering, and it's my life's work. I know you didn't mean what you just said. If you could only hear yourself, Keish. Sorry, dear, you know I respect you, and I'm exceedingly proud of the way you bring succor to those unfortunate women. That's better. In fact, I idolize you, my one and only goddess. MEENA's blood was reaching a boiling point, but she tried to stay calm. Keish would be better in the morning when the alcohol was no longer running through his veins. I'm going to jump a few pages beyond. She's gotten so fed up that she just storms off away from the table and leaves him sitting there. Oh no, before that, one more passage here. Finally, Keish admits that he's feeling down because he's been passed over. Here we go again, Keish grunted, worshiping any fat slob with a white face. Why are we Indians so damn insecure, as if we all had small penises? Pardon? This bloody country worships the lingam, the holy sausage. He held the empty glass in the air as if to make a toast. To the millions of peckers in every temple, under every banyan tree, in every home, long ones, short ones, fat ones, skinny ones, even cold ones, like the natural ice lingam in Amarnath. Now that's original, huh? An ice cold hard-on. Are you finished, Keish? I suppose. Well, you can see Keish is not a particularly nice guy when he gets drunk. And even when he's not drunk, he's a terrible misogynist. But as we'll learn later, and I'll discuss this with you later on in the program, he's a very complex character who really uses this humor almost as a way, as a defense mechanism, as a way to protect himself and vent his anger against the injustices, because he does feel them very, very strongly. And we'll get to that later. In any case, MEENA, I want to read you one or two more passages from this first chapter. MEENA finally storms off and goes to her bedroom, where she is lying on her bed, and she looks over at a photograph of her and her husband, Keish, her new husband, Keish, on their honeymoon. MEENA recalled the first night of their honeymoon as they sat on the steps of the famous Meenakshi temple. Her new husband described the green elements of India's architects deployed over 10 centuries ago, how large slabs of stone around the temple inhaled the cool nighttime air and exhaled it during the hot day, as if the goddess were cooling the feet of her devotees with her own breath. That night, Keish likened the clear rays of the autumnal moon to drops of milk. He recited an ancient Sanskrit poem about Soma, the moon god, whose nectar was supposed to bestow never-ending life. He turned to her and whispered how the ambrosia from her lips was all he needed to ensure his immortality. And that she, Meenakshi, which is a long form of MEENA, Meenakshi was his private temple, since her body would confer its blessing on him night after night. No, it wasn't hard to fall in love with a man who made green building strategies sound like love poetry, and who compared her young, insecure body to one of India's holiest temples. Now, that's MEENA. Keish, on the other hand, finally meanders into the den. He's pretty soused at this point. Above the TV hung a drawing of Durga sitting side saddle on her tiger, the independent goddess who never married. Her 10 arms formed a perfect circle around her body like a spinning wheel. He pursed his lips and blew a smoke ring into her fleshy cheeks. For a moment, it looked as if a lasso had caught her around the neck. Then the smoke dissipated and she was free again. He sank into the couch and picked up a book of Indian miniatures from the coffee table. The cover showed a husband fallen on his knees, supplicating his wife after he had returned home from a tryst. The man's lip bore his mistress's teeth marks, and his chest was smeared with sandalwood paste that once adorned her breasts. Ripened mangoes bent the branches of a fruit tree in the background. Keish had read enough Sanskrit poetry to know how the story would end. His wife would feign anger, and the husband would demand she punish him with a kick. Affair, anger, punishment, forgiveness. Wasn't that the ancient formula? If only MEENA would give me a good hard kick and fall into my arms. But she didn't even notice his affairs, much less feign anger. He stubbed out the cigarette and bit off a torn hangnail on his thumb. Soon his cuticle was bathed in blood. Well, that's a bit of the beginning. And I wanted to give you a sense because I think even though this is a thriller, there's murder, there's sex, there's political intrigue, and a lot to keep you turning the pages quickly, I think. I think of it also as literary fiction. The characters have very deep, complex personalities, and I hope you get a little bit of the sense of that from what I've just read. So what time? It's now 4:30. Let me just read one passage where, so Simon is the American architect who is hired finally to come and do this, design this community center, which is the nodal, what they call in India, the nodal building, the main building of the new community center. And Keish brings Simon to the project site. But before they get to the project site, on the first day he arrives in India, they tour the temple, the local temple, which is very old. It's a 13th century temple. And they meet a very nutty priest who has a conversation with Simon about architecture and philosophy and all sorts of different subjects. Then Simon finally arrives at his hotel at night, and he's lying in bed that evening and thinking about the strange visit to the temple, which played over and over in his mind. Keish and the priest were surely carved out of the same stone. Upi, that is the short name of Upadhyaya, who is the priest, was like a busy Hindu temple, teeming not with erotic friezes, but with wild notions and erotic poems. Just as the temple's busy architecture was meant to overwhelm its devotees, Upi himself overwhelmed. He called himself a chief overwhelming officer, COO. He was a chief overwhelming officer indeed. How different India was from his beloved China, where temples expressed a universal beauty and harmony, the emptiness of Buddhism. How could he possibly design a community center for MEENA's women? How could he express the Hindu sense of life's fullness and still convey peace and tranquility, a healing quality, a sense of being overwhelmed in a good way? Room service arrived with a 16-ounce Taj Mahal beer. Simon sat in the reading chair nursing the drink. He recalled Keish saying, "In the end, fullness is emptiness, Simon." Keish had invited Simon to imagine a child drawing black lines on a sheet of white paper with a thick crayon. The kid goes nuts, frantically scribbling more and more lines until the paper is all black. Then Keish asked, "Now, Simon, what do you see, emptiness or fullness?" He finished his beer and thought about Upi making that ridiculous bitter lemon face when he recited the Sanskrit love poem. And didn't Keish say that the word for lotus, India's national flower, literally meant born in the mud? And what did Keish say Indians do when they're moved by a raga? They say, "Kya baat hai?" What's the matter? When one's heart is filled with joy, something's the goddamn matter? This was not a world of happy sunflowers growing in American cornfields. Indians seem to express the human condition differently. He recalled Keish saying there was a word in Sanskrit that meant both beauty and salty, since salt brings out the flavor in food. Beauty came not with a bitter face, but beauty came with a bitter face, a salty taste. Were Indian women never sweethearts? And things seem to morph from one thing into another. By some linguistic magic, poets turn their lovers into goddesses, and temples with fussy facades suddenly felt like peaceful sanctuaries. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to imagine a Hindu temple becoming so busy that it became a tranquil sanctuary. It didn't work. He was an architect, not an alchemist. There was no way in hell he could design a women's center in a country where busyness overwhelmed in a good way. As soon as he got back to Washington, he would turn the project over to Anand. His colleague grew up in Pune and was far better qualified to figure out if a piece of paper could be so full it was empty, or so empty it was full. Simon ordered a second beer. As he waited, he felt empty inside, an emptiness with no hint of fullness. Okay, now for the last passage, I'm going to read you. Simon finally comes back a year later and is presenting his design for this center to Mr. Behera and MEENA. And remember Lalita, of course, from the beginning. And now, at this point, he's really gone through the whole design of everything in the whole building, except for one thing. And now the moment you've been waiting for, Simon said with a smile. He clicked the remote, the bird's nest. MEENA clenched her fists in anticipation. This feature would impress Mr. Behera like nothing he'd ever seen before, or it would fall flat on its face. A small round room appeared on the screen. The walls were covered in deep blue velvet. The floor looked like a giant cushion. Simon kept pressing the remote one by one. Streaks of light started to emerge from within the walls. Going in every which direction, they looked like twigs, illuminated under a full moon. Simon continued to click, and the number of lines slowly multiplied until the entire room resembled a bird's nest under the moonlight. All of a sudden, a constellation appeared on the ceiling. It was Sagittarius, Lalita Devi's sign. MEENA looked over at Behera, whose mouth had dropped in awe. This room is deep within the ground floor of the center, Simon said. Here, women can sit comfortably in total darkness, or using a remote, they can illuminate the walls and create their own nests. Behera scrunched his eyes as if fighting back tears. This bird's nest is the sanctuary, Simon said, a sacred place, like the inner sanctum of a Hindu temple. It's a place of comfort and healing. Well, I think that's enough reading. I'm not going to, I wanted to concentrate on passages which give you a sense of the characters and the style and not the action, because the action, when you start getting into the action, there's too much risk of giving you spoilers that are going to give away the whole plot. So I hope you get a sense in any case.
Well, that was a perfect taste of what we can expect for your novel. A lot of really nice imagery from the passages you read. And I'm wondering what, or if you can speak a little bit about why people should read your book and what you would expect readers to take away from reading your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I see the book as working on three levels. First of all, I think it's a good thriller, right? It's a love story with sex and murder and a complex murder investigation, all thrown in for good measure. All this against the backdrop of a highly charged political environment. So that's kind of the first, most surface level. The second level is it's a window into modern India, and not just the India of the yogis and mysticism and the India that we often think of when we think of India. But it's the real people who live in India today, in modern India, these sort of upper middle class people like MEENA and her husband. And these people are dealing with very real issues of India today, all the hot button issues, domestic violence, Hindu nationalism, corporate greed, and even green buildings, which has become a big movement in India today. But here's the clincher, that even though the book and the people of India today are dealing with these issues, I wanted to show that the past always has a way of creeping in to modern India. And you'll see throughout things like the esoteric Hindu rites coming to the fore, even some very sexual rites. You'll see the thing is sprinkled with not just Sanskrit court poetry, which was my field, but the way in which modern people will quote the poetry or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever it is, in order to justify something that they're arguing about. So it's a modern country, but even among very progressive people, you see hints of the past, sort of, like almost like weeds coming through the concrete. They're there. But finally, and maybe this is the most important thing, it's, as I said, about this progressive woman, MEENA, and how as a social activist, how as a feminist and social activist, she really takes on the patriarchal system. And I hope people get a sense of that side of India, because that's not reported in the Western press. That, you hear a lot about Modi today and the Hindu government and what they're doing to Muslims and so forth, but you don't necessarily get a sense of the opposition, the resistance, if you will. And MEENA certainly represents that. And it's not just MEENA. There's a police investigation after a murder. I'm not going to tell you who was murdered, but there's a police investigation. And the deputy police commissioner, a man named Kulkarni, he sides with MEENA in trying to overthrow this government. And when Simon asked him, why are you trying to do this? Why are you, police obey orders. They don't normally try to subvert the system, especially their own government, their own authorities. He tells the story of his daughter and how one of these Hindu fundamentalists who was high up in the government, he was like our Minister of Interior, came to him and asked if his daughter, who was a Harvard-educated MD, PhD, would commit sati, this horrible rite of throwing yourself into your husband's funeral pyre, when her young husband died very, very tragically and suddenly of prostate cancer. And the policeman, this Kulkarni, he's horrified. And he's horrified because the Hindu government wants to make this sati, this horrible practice, that he wants to make it a part of the new India, not just the old India. He wants to show that not just, poor villagers in Rajasthan are doing this, but Harvard-educated women in modern India are doing this to be faithful wives. And so the policeman is so horrified, and rightly so, by this meeting, this visit of the home minister, that he becomes a part of the book's effort to bring down this government. And lastly, and I want to say something about Kesh, because he is misogynist, but which is part of India. I mean, we can't help it. That is a part of India. It's the patriarchy. But he's also the crusader in chief for the green building industry. More than anyone in India, he is trying to change the entire construction industry. So even within a single individual, you see this complexity of modernity versus patriarchy or tradition. So that's a long answer, but I think that's what I would say. I hope people come away with these three. Enjoy the thriller, enjoy some of the issues, the hot button issues that are discussed, but also feel this tension of modern versus the old traditional country.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah.
Would it be a good time to open up for questions?
Please, if anybody has any questions, now or never.
Yeah, if anyone has a question or would like to speak up, please unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, my name is Felipe. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great.
Go on.
Ken, I must say, I read the book once, and I read it again kind of as in speed read mode today to get ready for your call. And, certain things leapt out at me today that didn't the first time. And I must make a remark that is very apt, talking about the lotus born in the mud. There is an aquatic garden here in Washington, D.C. called Kenilworth. It's a national park. And just 2 weeks ago, we visited the park, and there were the lotuses coming up, and they do descend into the mud, and they grow out of the mud in the spring, and you get to in the summertime, and you get to see these beautiful lotuses. So that's a very interesting and beautiful kind of description. What I had a question about, Ken, was you talked about another practice, Indian practice that I presume is an ancient practice, the Devadasi practice. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, the so-called
Yeah, and how it was outlawed, but it's not really, it's still around and people are still practicing it. Is that something that is still being practiced in India? And is that kind of a cause célèbre for some of these feminist, people in India who are trying to get rid of those kind of practices?
Well, yeah, there are these are the so-called temple dancers, which were very prevalent in the last few centuries. It was outlawed by the British, and for the most part, it has died out. But there probably are still some pockets in certain states where these temple dancers do perform. Now, you have to understand, though, their job description was more than being temple dancers. And I say that in two senses. On the one hand, there's the corruption of this institution in which they were prostituted, or so I read anyway, and money was made for the temple. On the other hand, and I don't think that was what I wouldn't say that was really the main way in which this tradition played itself out. But on the other hand, there are in India very ancient Hindu temple rites that use these dancers to bring rain and fertility and, do things that are done by priests in a Hindu temple. And some of them involve them dancing half naked in the dark with priests around. You can read about this in the novel, as you probably did. And Gita, who is MEENA's deputy, there's a chapter in which she goes to meet this German PhD student who is doing a thesis on these Devadasis, these temple dancers, because she wants to know the truth about them, because she feels that the Hindu party is misusing this tradition that it wants to bring back to India. So she eventually gets out of this woman, this German PhD student, some really some people would say fascinating, other people would say horrible, whatever it is, very, very jarring stories about what these temple dancers do in certain rituals. And so, I'm not an expert in this field. I've read some books, and I have a friend who wrote some of these, who is an expert on the temple dancers, and I had a long conversation, several conversations with her. It's hard to really understand what exists today, but my sense from talking with her and others is that the old tradition has pretty much died out. What's interesting, though, is these temple dancers or Devadasis, in a way, it's like everything else in India. You think of it as, some people will say they're just the wives of the gods masquerading as teen prostitutes. That's what Gita accuses them of in this conversation with with Upajaya, Upi, the temple priest in this one chapter. But others would say, no, the priest would say they were very well-respected members of the community. They were brought in for weddings and all sorts of rituals and feted and paid well for their services, non-sexual services. So that there was a certain sacred aura about them as well, because they were, quote unquote, married to the god of the temple, right? So that gave them a certain status. And in India, by the way, this is kind of interesting. In India, because they were married to the god, and the god never dies, right? The god is a statue in the temple. They're never widowed. And so they never face the horrible fate of widowhood in India, which you may know something about. Anyway, we could go on and on about these Devadasis. It's a fascinating subject, and you can ponder it reading the book. What can I say? Any other questions? No.
I have a follow-up one, if that's okay.
Sure.
Anybody who knows Ken knows that Ken loves to eat Indian food. And I must say, you have a number of sections in your book where you describe Indian food and people eating Indian food. And I greatly enjoyed those sections. So kudos to you on that one. Yes, I said that's a book by Ken.
Well,
My question is this. I know you traveled to India after you wrote the book. Was there any reaction among Indian friends and colleagues to this book at all?
no, I traveled to India. It's true. I brought my family 2 summers, a year and a half ago, right before the pandemic hit. But the book hadn't been published yet, and I didn't discuss it with anyone. So I do have a lot of Indian friends on Facebook, and I've gotten some positive reactions from my Indian friends. But I don't, this is a complicated subject because it is so anti the Hindu fundamentalist movement in India today.
Can you go to the front?
Lakshmi, please put this on mute. We hear you. Because it is very controversial what I'm saying about the Hindu party. I've been afraid to really market this book in India because, people in that party have been very intolerant of journalists and authors and others who have expressed any opposition to what they're doing. It's kind of like a fatwa, what Salman Rushdie experienced with his book. So I'm sort of keeping it close to my chest when it comes to revealing, making it available. And it's available. It's on Amazon.in, which is Amazon India, but without marketing it. There's a very small group of people who've read it, I'm sure. Okay. Anyone else before we sign off?
Hello,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, hi Ken, this is Lakshmi.
Hi, Lakshmi.
Just to say that a Sanskrit scholar termed successful entrepreneur has written a very wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm an Indian living in India. So this is a follow-up to the question that was asked earlier as to any of your friends have read it. I did. I think, Ken, given your love of India and your knowledge of India, you really captured it beautifully in so much depth in terms of characterization, as well as describing the locale, your description of Sompur, which is a fictitious town, but nevertheless captures so much of what the little towns in India. So I really enjoyed it. And I think the next thing that you need to do is to do an autobiography, because you've got such a wealth of experience and knowledge that would be, something that we would all look forward to read.
Well, those are very kind words, Lakshmi. I appreciate it. I did hesitate giving you the book, I have to say.
No, I think you did the right thing. You should disseminate it to as many friends and as many people as possible.
Okay.
Because I don't think you should worry at all about reactions, no matter what background or what, what is their dispensation or what is their orientation, because I think the book in itself has got a lot of very interesting scenarios, and you cover so much of it, including not only the political climate, but also the social climate. And I think your knowledge of what happens, I run an NGO, so I'm someone who's very sensitive to the way they portray it. And I thought the way you portrayed what MEENA was doing with the NGO was extremely well done. So I think you really have covered your bases.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, and I'm going to appoint you by my bodyguard when I take it to India.
Well, if you are crazy enough to do that, then anyway, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else?
Ken, can you speak about the art on the book and talk about the front cover a little bit?
Well, it was done by a professional, and it's supposed to represent, the kind of an inner shrine of a temple. That's all, with these, these oil lamps. Has everybody seen the cover? It's just supposed to give you the flavor of a temple ritual in India, and nothing more than that. Okay. Well, I hope you guys will pick up the book if you haven't already, and
If
go
anyone,
have your gin and tonics now and enjoy the rest of the day. All right. For those of you who are on the vineyard, jump in the ocean.
also get a copy of the book from the library because we have a copy.
Oh, good.
There.
That's great.
Or
The
buy
Westminster Library has it, and the Edgartown bookstore has it, and of course Amazon and the usual suspects as well. Okay.
Thank you, Ken.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you all for coming. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Ken.
you taking the time.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Great story.